Greetings, patricians, and welcome to the first episode of the Gigachad Book Club. Today, we will be talking about the life of Osamu Dazai, and how it is mirrored in his final novel, No Longer Human. I'd like to encourage everyone to participate as they are able, either in the comments section or by following my Twitter or the official subreddit. Links will be provided in the description. Now, without further ado, let's dive into today's novel. What is the toll that a weak man takes on his family, on his society, on himself? What is the human cost of cowardice? Can the weight of such a man be measured in tears or in blood? Is such a man a victim of circumstance and upbringing, or a villain, intent on shielding the world from the truth of his treacherous intent? No Longer Human is not a novel about a sympathetic individual. It is not simply a retelling of events similar to the life of the author. If you have been roped into feeling pity for the character of Yozo, then you have fallen into the trap that he built for you. The same trap that led the people around him to misery and death. In writing this semi-autobiographical tale, Osamu Dazai has given us a glimpse into the mind of unrepentant evil, the most sinister nature of the weak man. And perhaps the biggest tragedy of the novel is not of Dazai's making, but of our own for not treating such a man with the contempt he deserves. Before we delve much deeper into the story, let's take a moment to talk about its author. Dazai was the 8th child of one of Aomori Prefecture's wealthiest families. His youth was one of great pampering and excess. Despite the success of his father and grandfather, their family was not of noble status. They belonged to a burgeoning class of the nouveau riche in Japan that emerged as the influence of the samurai of the Edo period waned. Like many authors of his time, he wrote under a pseudonym. His real name was Shuji Tsushima. His father was a politician, and as his mother was chronically ill, Dazai was cared for mostly by the handmaids and servants that the Tsushima family kept. His father passed away when he was still a teenager, and shortly thereafter, he enrolled in the literature department of Hirosaki University. Dazai saw success very early on in college, eventually becoming a staff member for the school newspaper. However, this success was short-lived, as in July of 1927, his idol, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, committed suicide. From this point forward, we see Dazai's life took a dark turn. He began to neglect his studies, preferring instead to waste his allowance on alcohol and prostitutes. He became affiliated with the heavily suppressed Marxist movement, and in 1929, he made his first attempt at suicide. He survived and managed to graduate the following year, moving to Tokyo in 1930, where he was accepted as a student of French literature at Tokyo Imperial University. His career as a student was not to last. Expelled for neglecting his studies, Dazai ended up trying to run away with a geisha named Hatsuyo Oyama, something that got him formally disowned by his parents. Shortly after, he attempted suicide with a 19-year-old hostess named Shimeko Tanabe by drowning. Tanabe died in the effort, but Dazai's life was saved by a fishing boat that pulled him from the water. It is here that we see how closely the character of Yozo mirrored the real life of Dazai, and why we may safely assume that No Longer Human is less of a novel and more of a thinly veiled confession of a deeply troubled man. The influence of his family ensured that Dazai would remain legally unscathed for his part in the death of Tanabe. After he recovered, he married Oyama, but the law was soon to catch up with him again, and he was arrested for his affiliation with the Japanese Communist Party. It is worth mentioning that despite being officially disowned by his family, his elder brother was constantly looking out for him, even agreeing to reinstate his allowance should he settle down and start taking his life more seriously. Something for a time Dazai was able to do successfully. While the early 1930s proved to be a productive time for him, he eventually developed a crippling addiction to morphine, and in 1936 he was admitted into a mental hospital and forced to quit cold turkey. During his incarceration, his wife purportedly had an affair with his best friend, leading to another double suicide attempt. This failed, and soon after the couple divorced. Dazai quickly remarried and had his first child in 1941. His poor health kept him from serving in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. Despite his house being burned down twice in American bombing raids in Tokyo, neither he nor his family were ever injured. During the war, he managed to continue publishing with success, despite the heavy censorship of the era. After the surrender of Japan in 1945, Dazai's popularity as an author vastly increased, though this fact would not bring him any happiness. He fell back into his old addictions, going as far as having affairs with his fans, and even birthing a child out of wedlock. Eventually, his displeasure with life led him to abandon his wife and children in favor of a war widow named Tomie Yamazaki. In 1948, he penned No Longer Human while staying with her at a resort in Atami, but this would prove to be his last novel. In June of that year, he successfully committed double suicide with Tomie by drowning themselves in the Tamagawa Canal. No Longer Human is almost a one-to-one summarization of the life of Osamu Dazai, but interestingly, the story is presented through the eyes of a third party. The nameless narrator, who in many ways reacts to Yozo in the way that Dazai believed a real-world person would react to him. When the tale begins, the narrator is examining 3 separate photos of the same man, one from his childhood, one from his adolescence, and one from adulthood. One can imagine that this might be how the story came about. Dazai sitting alone in his home, looking at an album of himself, seeing the monster in those pictures that no one else could see. He reflects on this, and thus starts the novel off properly with the famous line, "Mine has been a life of much shame." The first notebook of our main character, Yozo, reveals to us immediately that, although he might be trying to give an account of his life, he is not doing so in a way that is completely honest. Perhaps, though a part of him might recognize and despise the coward beneath the mask, he is never able to fully come out and say it. Immediately, Yozo begins to list ways in which he is different and separated from other human beings. He mentions losing taste for things once he realizes their practical purpose. He also states quite clearly that he has never felt hunger, though he does so while downplaying the fact that he is from an extremely wealthy family. While one might take this at face value, and perhaps see this as the first signs of madness in a child, I think what we see here might be quite common for those raised in an environment that is completely free from struggle. He doesn't know hunger, not because something is wrong with him, but because his family affords to feed him so generously. One of Yozo's primary traits is his inability to deal with criticism, and while he recognizes that nobody finds it pleasant to deal with being criticized, he thinks that his fear of reproach is somehow much greater than his fellow humans. Perhaps the most tragic part of the first notebook is the recognition of a pattern of reward for his misbehavior. At no point is Yozo ever directly confronted for his buffoonery. Even his teachers laugh off his antics, something that fuels his need to keep acting the jester. Instead of ever needing to confront the reality of his feelings, he is in fact encouraged to ignore them, to keep up the act, no matter what. There are parts of the story where Yozo displays surprising levels of self-awareness. On page 35, Yozo says, "I smiled in my weakness. If I had formed the habit of telling the truth, I might perhaps have been able to confide unabashedly to my father or mother about the crime, but I could not fully understand even my own parents." Not only this, but Yozo is forthcoming about perhaps the most painful experience of his youth, the experience that I believe is the root of his deep-seated fear of fellow humans. Starting on page 36, Yozo goes into detail about a speech he attended as a boy, given by a prominent member of the political party his father belonged to. During the ride home with his servants and family friends, he overhears them berating his father for his inept speech, but once they get home, they shower his father with praise. Even though Yozo calls this a small example, I don't think it is actually that small. If it were, he would not remember it with such clarity. Instead, Yozo is exposed from a very young age to the duplicity of people one might call their friends, and how no one can ever truly be trusted. As I said in the beginning, if you are under the impression that this is a tale of a man deserving of redemption, you have been deceived, and that deception happened entirely within the first act of this tale. If you are willing to look through the lens that Dazai has given you in the first notebook without question, you will invariably come to the conclusion that this is a story of a man who didn't have a chance from the very get-go. This is a lie. While Yozo might be conscious of his shortcomings, he is not a man of such a small ego as to let the truth get in the way of how he paints himself, something which we will come to see very quickly in Part 2. The second notebook begins almost immediately with Yozo's first big challenge. A high school classmate, Takeichi, who sees through his charade and calls him out on it. By this time, Yozo's pathology has begun to cement itself. Unable to bear the thought of killing someone, Yozo opts instead to befriend the supposedly dim-witted Takeichi. Immediately, we see Yozo's pride color the narrative. Takeichi is simultaneously a puny simpleton, as well as one of the greatest threats to Yozo's performance. The irony is on full display here. If Yozo had been honest, if he had let Takeichi in and told him of his hopes and fears, he may have well earned himself his first true friend. By this time, however, it is much too late, and Yozo is completely unwilling to risk what he thinks he has built over the years. The meat of the second notebook, however, deals with Yozo's perception and interaction with women. Once again, I don't believe that Yozo's thoughts or experiences are anything different from a normal boy of his age. For boys, there is nothing more perplexing and mysterious as the mind of a girl. Even for Yozo, who has spent considerably more time with the opposite sex than his own, he is at a total loss as how to best understand them. Despite this ignorance, or perhaps in a way because of it, Yozo is able to interact with girls and women quite seamlessly. He gives them what they seem to want: attention, a listening ear, and food. Somewhat unsurprisingly, Yozo also develops a distinct passion for the arts. In fact, he is so taken by the paintings that he is introduced to by Takeichi that he declares immediately his desire to be a painter. In the artist, he sees the potential to express himself honestly, to show the world the color of his soul, but for reasons we will get into, he never realizes this dream, doomed to remain in his role of a jester. Too afraid to pursue his dream, he follows his father's orders and enters into a normal university. Predictably, however, he is unable to stomach dorm life. Unwilling to even give it a try, he gets a doctor's note that allows him to live off campus, his cowardice once again robbing him of one of life's most valuable experiences. It is then that we are introduced to Horiki, and the downward spiral of Yozo begins to accelerate. Horiki is an interesting character. While it's tempting to see him as a sort of devil-like figure out to tempt Yozo into leading a degenerate life, I believe that Horiki is in some ways Yozo's equal as a villain. He introduces Yozo to alcohol and prostitution, this is true. But it is Yozo himself who chooses to gorge himself on these vices without consideration of the harm it causes to himself or to others. For prostitutes in particular, he does not see living, breathing girls. Rather, he states outright that they are fellow non-humans like him. So much does he find himself craving their company, he openly admits that he would sell everything he had if only it meant their continued service. Perhaps owing to his hatred of the practical, however, once he realizes, thanks to Horiki's observation, that he has become quite the lady killer, he loses all interest in prostitutes. Despite Dazai's real-life connection to the Japanese Communist Party, He provides a rather seething critique of the movement here. In fact, he finds them all so ridiculous that they become much like the prostitutes in his eyes, completely irrational, perhaps not even human. Whether this is Dazai trying to distance himself politically from his past, or his genuine feelings about the people he had once been involved with, is unclear. Eventually, the ride comes to an end. He would spend all the allowance he was given within days of getting it, forcing him to beg his family for money. He starts frequenting pawn shops, and despite his apparent disdain for them, his position among the local communists grows. At the peak of his perceived misery, Yozo decides to die, and this is where we see the true villainous nature of a coward emerge. For Yozo, it is not good enough to die alone. He has to drag someone down with him. In this case, it is Tsuneko, though Yozo claims he doesn't recall if that is her actual name. Tsuneko is a tragic character. She ran away from home with her husband, who was eventually arrested for swindling someone, and is currently sitting in a jail cell. Everything about her that we need to know can be summed up from a single sentence on page 80, where she says, quote, "I feel so unhappy." In just 4 words, Tsuneko cuts right to Yozo's heart. While he has spent his entire life creating these webs of deception, too afraid of ever confronting the truth of his own situation, Tsuneko does so without even so much as a second thought. This statement shakes Yozo so hard that he avoids seeing her again for an entire month. In fact, he only returns to her during a night out with Horiki, when he has run out of money and he hopes that Tsuneko can help him. Page 85 gives us another insight into the shallow deception that Yozo employs to rope the reader into sympathy. Quote, "Just as Horiki had said, she really was a tired, poverty-stricken woman, and nothing more. But this thought itself was accompanied by a welling up of a feeling of comradeship for this fellow sufferer from poverty." Of course, Yozo is not poverty-stricken. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and every month he receives a generous allowance from his family. He attends a prestigious college. He lives a life of relative luxury. And this man has the gall to say that he is of a kindred spirit with a woman who has suffered greatly in her life, to the point where she is forced to work for the pleasure of other men. Yozo claims to have, for the first time, a feeling of love for a person. According to him, it was Tsuneko who proposed that they should die together, a claim that may or may not be true. In fact, we see how quickly Yozo resolves to die when confronted with the fact that he has no more money. Given his history of deceit, I find it more likely that he persuaded her to die with him, and her, being as miserable as she was, happily agreed. After the attempted suicide, Yozo laments losing his first love. But again, his grief seems less than sincere, as in no time at all he is back to playing his old games, this time feigning coughing up blood in a bid for leniency. This almost gets him into trouble, as again, similar to the incident with Takeichi, he is called out by the district attorney about whether or not his coughing fits were indeed real. With the charges against him suspended, Yozo goes to live with his guarantor, Flatfish, and it is here that we enter the final leg of our journey. The third and final of Yozo's notebooks is by far the longest and most substantial. There is far more that occurs within these pages than can be easily summarized here. So, for the sake of brevity, I will briefly touch on the main points that cement Yozo's place as a cowardly villain in his own narrative. One might think that a tragedy of the magnitude Yozo experienced would leave a permanent mark on the man and inspire him to change. Normally, this would be the case. But with Yozo, we discover very quickly that it is not. In fact, it is clear, at least at the point of writing his journal, Yozo still harbors quite a resentment of Flatfish for not just giving him the facts and telling him what to do. Instead, Flatfish forces Yozo to give him an answer from his heart about what he wants for the future. And painfully, the answer Yozo provides, to become a painter, gets immediately mocked by Flatfish. This might be the only point in the story where I felt truly bad for Yozo. To go so long without ever telling others the truth, only to get laughed at when you finally get the courage to do so, must be a devastating experience. So great was Yozo's shame, he leaves a note for Flatfish and runs away back to Tokyo. Having nowhere else to go, Yozo turns to his old friend, Horiki, and tries once more to live a life on his own. Through Horiki, Yozo is introduced to a woman named Shizuko, who works for a magazine publisher. Through her, Yozo achieves somewhat stable employment as a cartoonist, although this too is a source of much pain to him. Once again, Yozo attempts for a fleeting moment to be honest, this time to Shizuko, telling her of his talent as an artist. But when he thinks his comment is in jest, he immediately retracts and says that he is in fact a simple cartoonist. Perhaps the most significant moral revelation Yozo has occurs while getting lectured by Horiki on how he must stop fooling around with women. On page 119, Horiki says, quote, "You've gone far enough. Society won't stand for more." To Yozo, who has his whole life feared society as this nebulously oppressive mass, an almost godlike being with power over the individual, the realization that society is no more than the will of an individual serves to remove perhaps the last thread of morality in his corrupted heart. For after this realization, Yozo freely admits that he was able to act much more in accordance with his own inclinations, and his inclinations are without a doubt laced with evil. This new philosophy soon leads him to commit various crimes, the first of which being theft of Shizuko's clothes that he pawns for drinking money. The supposed guilt from his actions leads him to run away with another woman, the owner of a bar in Kyobashi, who he stays with for nearly a year. It is during this time that Yozo meets his final and perhaps most tragic victim, the 17-year-old virgin, Yoshiko. Yoshiko, unlike the other women Yozo has manipulated up to this point, is still a naive youth, a girl who has never had her trust broken, one who cannot hope to see Yozo for who he truly is. It is this purity that sparks Yozo's almost perverse attraction to this girl. On page 132, Yozo says, quote, "Yoshiko's pale face was smiling as she sat there, inside the dimly lit shop. What a holy thing uncorrupted virginity is, I thought. I had never slept with a virgin, a girl younger than myself. I'd marry her. I wanted once in my lifetime to know that great savage joy, no matter how immense the suffering that might ensue." And so, Yozo and Yoshiko marry, and here, Yozo's final crimes are revealed. On a summer's day, while Horiki and Yozo are getting drunk on the roof, Yoshiko is raped. Horiki, seeing what is happening from the second floor, rushes to get Yozo, who makes no effort to help his young wife. Instead, he runs away and collapses in tears on the roof. Even knowing the identity of her assailant, Yozo does not try to take revenge nor seek the help of the police. Surprisingly, Yozo feels less animosity toward the man who raped his wife than he does to Horiki, who in Yozo's mind is to blame for not stopping the act earlier. Adding to this, Yozo refuses to forgive Yoshiko. He begins to imagine what other men Yoshiko has been with, even going so far as to believe that she has been carrying on an adulterous relationship with Horiki. Unable to cope, Yozo turns once more to suicide, this time ingesting a bottle of sleeping pills. Once again, Yozo survives, blaming his circumstance now not on himself, but on the women around him. Unable to take responsibility for his actions, Yozo continues his downward spiral. He quickly becomes addicted to morphine, and in a twist of irony, begins having an affair with a crippled widow from the pharmaceutical shop. Robbed of hope, Yozo chooses to pen a letter to his father in one last bid for assistance. Curiously, he leaves out all details of his greatest crimes, those involving the women around him, but the response from his father never comes, and Yozo decides for a third time to take his own life. Before he can do the deed, however, he is visited by Horiki and Flatfish, and forced into an insane asylum, where he is locked up for months until he can overcome his addiction. At the end of the third month, Yozo is visited by his brother and Flatfish, who inform him of his father's death, leaving Yozo eviscerated. His brother promises Yozo that he will take care of him, and sends him to live in a home back in the countryside. An empty shell of a man, a criminal who never answered for his crimes, a coward who never could take the blame for his own suffering, a spoiled brat who in the end can still only live off the graciousness of those around him, never free of the kindness of the human beings he so despises. The last line of the last page is, I believe, one of the greatest attempts at deception in literary history. On page 177 we read, quote, "It's his father's fault," she said unemotionally. "The Yozo we knew was so easygoing and amusing. And if only he hadn't drunk. No, even though he did drink, he was a good boy, an angel." Dazai's final attempt at redemption is the exact same as all the others, pushing the blame on someone or something else. It is one of the greatest crimes in literary history that entire generations of readers have learned to feel pity for this man. Critics from across the globe have taken this novel either as a critique of modern Japanese society, or as a tragic tale of the individual trying to fit into the world around him. But the truth was sitting right in front of their eyes the whole time. This is no critique. It is a weak-kneed confession. And as my last piece of evidence, I offer you this passage. Just before Yoshiko is raped, we are privy to the conversation between Horiki and Yozo, in which Horiki says the following, quote, "That's right. I'm not a criminal like you. I may indulge myself with a little dissipation, but I don't cause women to die, and I don't lift money from them either." This is the cold, hard truth. No matter his circumstance, no matter who he was as a child, or how strained his relationship was with his father, Yozo, like the man who created him, is nothing more than a font of evil. Thank you everyone for listening to the first episode of the Gigachad Book Club. Did you enjoy today's novel? What would you like to read in the future? Please leave a comment, join the subreddit, and follow me on social media in the links below.